So today we will be talking about the Berlin Conference, also known as the Scramble for Africa. Now, in order to set the stage for this, we have to travel back in time, prior to the 1880s. Now, back then, not a lot was known about the interior of Africa. In fact, the Europeans referred to this as the Dark Continent. Now, today, saying that would have some racist undertones. However, back then, it just simply meant that the continent was mysterious. They didn't know a whole lot about Africa. Therefore, it was the Dark Continent. Now, in the late 1400s, the Portuguese set up a fort at the mouth of the Congo River. A little bit later, the slave trade started to go out from the West African coast. European nations had set up a lot of trade routes from Africa, but they only dealt with coastal areas. If they wanted anything from the interior of Africa, they relied on tribes that would travel inwards and retrieve what they needed. Now, a little bit later, European missionaries began traveling into Africa in an attempt to convert Africans to Christianity. Now, the first explorer that we are going to talk about will be Dr. David Livingstone. He was one of the first European explorers to explore the interior of the continent. In fact, he was the first one to make it from the west coast to the east coast of Africa and make it back to Europe alive. His first mission was in 1845, where he had started out as a missionary. However, he was not very successful in this. Records show that he was only ever able to convert one single African to Christianity. Because of this, he decided that he would instead prefer to explore Africa and learn their ways. He figured in order to better convert the Africans to Christianity, they would need a better understanding of the Africans. Soon after exploring Africa, he dedicated his time to abolishing the slave trade. Dr. Livingstone had made multiple missions out into Africa, the most famous of which was his mission to find the source of the Nile River. Before leaving Europe, he had made the claim that he would not return until the source of the Nile had been found. Now, he was convinced that the source of the river was Lake Victoria. Unfortunately, he would die before the source was found, and he was proven to be correct that it was in fact Lake Victoria. However, he had disappeared for 6 years, and the European nations began to wonder where he had gone. And that is where we are introduced to our next explorer, Henry Morton Stanley. Henry Morton Stanley was a journalist hired to find Livingstone. The difference between the two explorers was that whenever Livingstone would go into the interior of Africa, he would travel alone or in very, very small groups. He was known for traveling light and making friends with the local tribes. Stanley, however, came in with a moving party that would cut down large swaths of the jungle in order to make a path for Stanley to travel through. He would also hunt wild game while he was down there. Now, eventually Stanley would find Livingstone after learning from a couple different locals that there was a European man staying in a local village. Whenever he approached the village, he found Dr. Livingstone, and that's where we get the famous quote, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Now, Dr. Livingstone did not want to return as he had not found the source of the Nile River. So Dr. Livingstone gave Stanley his journal with all of his notes, and Stanley was able to return to Europe as a hero. Now, shortly after this expedition, Stanley was approached and hired by Belgium's King Leopold II to travel the Congo. But we will get into that in the next lesson. Now that we've covered a little bit of Africa, we have to move back up to Europe. At the time, Europe was in what was called a balance of power. Now, what this meant was they did not want one nation to be more powerful than the other, and this included the colonies. They didn't want one nation to have more colonies than any other. So the former German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck came up with a plan. He decided that they would hold a conference and they would divide up Africa amongst the nations in an equal manner. Now, this became the Berlin Conference of 1885. The conference actually ran from November 1884 to February 1885. There were 13 European nations present and the United States. But do you know who was not present? There was not a single African present at this conference. Now, this meant that there would be very little understanding of the political landscape of Africa as they divided up the continent. First, a few ground rules were established. This became known as the General Act of the Berlin Conference on West Africa. It established that there would be free travel through the Congo River, that they would work towards the abolition of the slave trade through African nations, and they also established the principle of effective occupation. This meant that colonial rule had to be current, and they could not have colonies in name only. The governments of the colonies had to work together with the governments of the nations. They also established at this time that King Leopold II would keep private ownership of the Congo. Now, this will become important next lesson. Now, if you'll take a look at the map, on the left-hand side, you will see the division of tribes within Africa. You'll notice that a lot of these tribes took up a little bit of land here and there, scattered unevenly across the continent. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see how Africa was divided amongst the European nations. As you can tell, a lot of tribes were placed into the same colonies, meaning they had to work together in groups that they had not typically worked with before. As you may notice, some of the tribes may have been split up across these borders drawn by the European nations. Now, these borders would prove to be problematic for Africa in the future. In conclusion, we have learned that the European nations split Africa into divisions without taking into consideration any political divide within Africa already there. That concludes this lesson. Have a nice day.